Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The photograph is faded, its edges curling with time. A girl no older than 16 stares back at you, her expression caught somewhere between fear and defiance. Her features are striking, but not in the way you'd expect. Her jawline sits uneven, her eyes slightly misaligned, as though her very face carries the burden of generations before her. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in trembling handwriting, are only 4 words. His child, my father. It sounds impossible, unthinkable. But buried within the forgotten corners of rural America are stories so twisted, so carefully hidden, that even whispers of them never left the family home. And this girl's story, pregnant not by a lover, not by a stranger, but by her own grandfather, is one of those tragedies. You won't find this tale in school textbooks. You won't find it in local newspapers. Families like hers went to extreme lengths to bury their shame, to weave silence into the very soil their homes were built on. Yet traces remain, in oral histories, in sealed court documents, in the reluctant testimonies of neighbors who looked the other way. Her name has been lost to history. Maybe that was intentional. But in the records that survived, she is described simply as the girl who carried the curse of a bloodline that refused to open its doors to the outside world, the girl who lived in a house with boarded-up windows where kinship was mistaken for ownership, and where obedience was demanded through fear. The pregnancy was never celebrated. It was not spoken of openly, even within the walls of her own family, but her swelling belly was a secret that couldn't stay hidden forever. To Ome, she was a victim. To others, she was simply the product of a family too entangled in itself to ever escape. This is not a love story. This is not even a story of lust. This is a story of control, of generational decay, of what happens when silence festers long enough to become tradition. Tonight we peel back the layers of that silence, uncovering a past the world was never meant to see. The house still stands. Locals say it leans a little more each year, its paint long peeled away, its windows clouded by grime. From the outside, it looks like any forgotten farmhouse, one of thousands abandoned across America's rural backroads. But if you step closer, if you dare peer through the rotting frame of the porch, you'll notice the details. Rusted locks on the inside of bedroom doors, wooden boards nailed across certain windows, not to keep intruders out, but to keep someone in. Inside, the smell of mildew mixes with the ghost of wood smoke. The wallpaper, where it hasn't collapsed into dust, is stained with watermarks that look like spreading bruises. A single rocking chair sits in the living room, its seat worn smooth by years of use. This is where the grandfather sat, a man who was both feared and obeyed, a patriarch who demanded absolute control over the family's future, even if that future was written in blood. The girl grew up in this house, learning early that her world extended only as far as the fence line. Neighbors were distant, visits rare, and trips into town always accompanied by her grandfather's stern, watchful presence. He dictated what she wore, what she said, and who she spoke to. To outsiders, she barely existed. To him, she was his creation, a vessel meant to carry on the line he believed must remain pure. It's tempting to think of her as powerless, but that strips her of something vital. Even within the suffocating grip of her grandfather's authority, she resisted in small, almost invisible ways. Some nights, she would etch marks into the wood beneath her bed frame, a hidden calendar only she could read, counting down days she never explained. Other times, she would sneak scraps of paper into the stove before anyone else could see what she had written. The words burned away, but the act itself was rebellion. When the pregnancy began to show, whispers spread quietly among the few neighbors close enough to notice. They never asked questions. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps they already knew, and silence was easier than acknowledging the horror across the fence line. For the girl, silence was survival. To speak the truth would mean punishment, perhaps even worse, and so she carried not only the weight of her unborn child, but the crushing burden of a secret meant to die within her walls. In families like hers, secrets were guarded more fiercely than possessions, and in this case, the secret wasn't just about shame, it was about legacy. The grandfather believed that keeping the bloodline pure was his duty. Twisted by superstition and an obsessive fear of outsiders, he convinced himself that the family's survival depended on turning inward, generation after generation. He didn't see the girl as a granddaughter. He saw her as property, a link in a chain he refused to let break. But blood has a way of betraying those who try to control it. Inbreeding leaves its marks, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The girl's face told its own story. The asymmetry of her features, the way her eyes never seemed to focus in quite the same direction, the fragility of her frame. These weren't accidents of nature. They were the echoes of decisions made long before she was born. She must have felt it too, the way people looked at her when she was led into town, the quiet stares, the murmurs behind her back. Children whispered that she was different. Adults shook their heads, but never spoke aloud the truth everyone suspected. In rural communities, everyone knows everyone's business, but in this case, people chose silence, as though pretending not to see would make the sickness in that house less real. The girl's pregnancy tore through that silence. It was undeniable proof of what had been whispered for years. She carried the evidence with every step, every glance downward at the child growing inside her. And yet, no one intervened. There were no police reports, no doctor's visits documented, no public outcry. The community, bound by fear and complicity, looked away. Still, scraps of her voice survive. A fragment of a letter discovered decades later hinted at her state of mind. Written in shaky handwriting, the words are simple: "This child is mine, but it is Hayes. Is too. I pray no one will know." No name was signed, but the timing, the location, and the handwriting matched what little is known of her. Imagine the despair in those words. She wasn't just carrying a child, she was carrying the crushing weight of a family's curse. Every kick inside her womb was both a reminder of her own violation and a warning that the cycle would continue unless someone broke it. But no one did. Not yet. As her body changed, so did the atmosphere in the house. The grandfather grew more possessive, more paranoid. He no longer allowed her to fetch water from the well alone or linger by the window. Every movement was watched, every word measured. He told her she was chosen, that her pregnancy was proof of destiny, not sin, but beneath his words lingered a darker truth. He knew the outside world would never accept what he had done. When the baby was born, it arrived in silence. No midwife, no doctor, no birth certificate. Just the girl, her grandfather, and the 4 suffocating walls that had always held them. Accounts from neighbors suggest they only realized the child existed when faint cries drifted across the fields late one night. By morning, the sound was gone, and no one dared to ask questions. What became of that infant has been debated ever since. Some say the child survived, raised in secrecy until eventually absorbed into the same cursed cycle. Others whisper that the baby was never meant to live at all, that the cries heard that night were its first and last. In either case, there is no official record, only fragments of rumor, handed down like ghost stories in hushed tones among locals. For the girl, the months after the birth marked a turning point. She began to wither, not just in body but in spirit. Witnesses recall seeing her once or twice in town, her eyes hollow, her steps unsteady. She clutched her stomach as if something inside her still ached. Some believe she carried another pregnancy soon after, a cruel continuation of the pattern. Others insist she was simply broken, both physically and emotionally, her body unable to recover from what had been forced upon it. In families where cycles like this took root, the outside world rarely intervened. Poverty, isolation, and fear built invisible walls as strong as any prison. For her, escape was almost unthinkable. Where could she go? Who would believe her? The man who had taken everything from her was the same man who controlled her food, her shelter, her very existence. And so, the silence continued. Generations of silence. Her story was only one chapter in a longer, darker book that the family would never willingly open. But like all secrets, the truth has a way of seeping out, leaving traces for those brave enough to look. There are towns across America where history feels like a shadow, pressing heavy against every rusted gate and crumbling wall. In this town, the shadow had a name: her family. To the locals, they were a presence best avoided, a reminder of something unnatural, lingering just beyond polite conversation. People pretended not to notice, but everyone carried a theory. Some whispered that strange illnesses plagued their children. Others claimed that when the girl walked past, animals grew restless, dogs barking as though they sensed something unseen. But the most chilling part was how ordinary it all looked from the outside. A farm, a family, a man caring for his kin. If you drove past quickly, you'd see nothing unusual. Only when you slowed down, only when you paid attention, did you notice the details: the missing mother, the silence at the dinner table, the girl who never spoke unless spoken to. Ordinary on the surface, rotten underneath. For the girl, this dual existence became unbearable. Inside, she lived under the command of a man who called himself family, but treated her as an heirloom. Outside, she lived as a ghost, drifting past neighbors who knew her secret, but refused to acknowledge it. She existed in a limbo where her suffering was visible but untouchable. The trauma left marks not just on her, but on everyone around her. Generations later, people in town still refused to speak openly about what happened, as though words themselves might bring the curse back to life. Children were warned to stay away from the farmhouse. Teenagers dared each other to sneak up to its door, only to flee when they heard the wind whistle through broken shutters. Even in silence, the place breathed menace. And yet, despite the fear, no one intervened. Perhaps because they told themselves it wasn't their business. Perhaps because confronting it would mean admitting they had allowed it to go on for years. The line between guilt and cowardice blurred until it was impossible to tell which was which. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent or risked everything to break the chain? Because the truth is this: the girl didn't just carry her own suffering, she carried the weight of an entire community's silence, and that silence, more than anything, sealed her fate. The deeper you trace her story, the more it feels less like a single tragedy and more like a ritual, a cycle repeated until it consumed every chance at escape. In her grandfather's mind, family was not about love or care, it was about control. To him, blood was ownership, and every child born was another chain locking the family tighter into itself. He believed outsiders brought corruption, disease, betrayal, so he turned inward, generation after generation, until the family tree curved back on itself like a serpent, devouring its own tail. But what he could not control were the cracks that appeared with each generation. The girl was one of those cracks. Her despair leaked out in small ways, in the letter fragments, in the marks carved into her bed frame, in the way her hollow stare haunted anyone who looked too long. Her suffering became a silent testimony, even if she never spoke the words out loud. Stories that circulate decades later describe her as both a victim and a warning. Some say she lost herself completely after the second pregnancy, her mind fracturing under the weight of repeated violations. Others insist she found small, defiant ways to resist, like sneaking food to her child when her grandfather turned his back, or whispering promises into its ear that someday the curse would end. We may never know which version is true, but what we do know is this: her life was reduced to choices no one should ever be forced to make. Forensic genealogy experts who've studied these types of cases point out that entire towns often carried bloodlines like hers hidden within their populations. Birth records altered, names changed, children listed as adopted, when in reality they were products of the same house. This was not an isolated nightmare. It was part of a broader, buried pattern across forgotten pockets of America. Her story is simply one of the few that still leak, as through the cracks of silence. Imagine the weight she must have carried, to know that the child in her arms was also her bloodline's prison, to know that every smile, every cry, every heartbeat tied her deeper to the very man who had stolen her future. And yet, despite the horror, she clung to life. That alone speaks of a strength we will never fully understand. Her story didn't end with her. The legacy continued, because legacies like these always do. Time eventually did what silence could not. The grandfather died, his body lowered into the same earth he had poisoned with his control. No obituary mentioned the truth, no grave marker confessed what he had done. He was remembered, at least officially, as a farmer, a father, a patriarch, but those who lived in the shadow of his house knew better. His death did not erase his sins, it only sealed them deeper into the soil, leaving others to carry the weight. As for the girl, history swallows her almost completely. No record of her death exists. Some say she vanished, spirited away by distant relatives who could no longer bear the shame. Others whisper she never left the house at all, that her body lies buried somewhere beneath its rotting floorboards. The truth has been lost, and perhaps that was intentional. Erasing her was easier than remembering her. But her presence lingers, in the town's silence, in the fragments of letters that escape the flames, in the stories passed down, hushed but never gone. She remains like a ghost, unnamed, unwanted, but unforgettable. And the child she bore, whether it lived or died, became the unanswered question that haunts every version of her story. Because if that child survived, the bloodline continued. And if it did, then somewhere out there descendants may still walk among us, unaware of the dark root that binds their family tree. This is what makes her story so chilling. It isn't simply about one girl, one act of violence, one broken life. It is about cycles of silence, of complicity, of generations repeating what should have ended long ago. Her suffering is a mirror, forcing us to ask how many other houses like hers once stood in the forgotten corners of America. How many other girls carried the same unbearable burden, erased before their names could ever be spoken. History doesn't keep all of its secrets buried. Sometimes it lets them slip through in whispers, in rumors, in records too fragile to destroy. And when we stumble across them, as we have tonight, we are reminded that the past is never as far away as we think. This was the story of the most inbred girl, pregnant by her grandfather. A story the world was never meant to hear, yet one that refuses to stay silent. If you found yourself disturbed, unsettled, or even haunted, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes history has no more secrets left to uncover. Because, as we've seen tonight, the darkest ones are often the ones no one dares to speak.